overcome. There's already those in tribulation. The fullness of times won't be long. We're lovers of self more than lovers of God. And there's pride in the hearts of everyone. We need to repent, turn from our ways, and overcome as He overcame. And if we're possibly lukewarm, then we have been forewarned. We need to repent, turn from our ways, and overcome as He overcame. And if we're possibly lukewarm, then we have been forewarned.
Oh Lord, we gather here today to lift our voices and hands in praise. Your love surrounds us, never fades. We worship You, our souls ablaze. Holy is Your name, forever we proclaim. Hallelujah, hallelujah, we sing to the King of all. Hallelujah, hallelujah, our hearts in awe. Oh, 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 our hearts in awe. Presence, we find peace and grace. Your mercy covers us like a warm embrace. We offer our lives a living sacrifice. Our faith in You will never die. Your light shines bright, guiding us through the night. Hallelujah, hallelujah, we sing to the King of all. Hallelujah, hallelujah, our hearts in Your. Oh, 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 hearts in Your. Our hearts in Your. Our hearts in Your.
Yeah, and if there's goodness in our lives, it's because of Jesus. And if our bodies are a living sacrifice, it's an offering to Him alone. Oh, I have failed Him, and you have failed too. But He is perfect, spotless, and brighter than the sun. We may be scattered, we may be torn, but our God is one.
From the Big Bang Theory to the creationalist view of this planet, from the stars and moons and all the galaxies, to where did humanity get its origins? Who is Jesus? And is he really God? And who are the angels? Do demons really exist? And if so, what are they? Really? I'm James. And this is Kenner. And this is Double-Minded Conversations Down the Rabbit Hole.
Nicaea is and what it isn't. What it is not is a group of people getting together in the early church and deciding what goes in and out of the Bible. That is not what the Council of Nicaea did. Primarily,
Can I stop you
Sure.
real quick? Sorry about that. I just saw that we were muted. And so I'm just going to start over everything real quick since no one heard it. But welcome back to the show. Welcome back to the channel. If you are new to the channel, please subscribe. If you're back to the channel, hey, like and share this live. Let's get us out. As you're coming in, go ahead and hit that like button. We like to thank or wish everyone a happy Father's Day to all the fathers out there, and to all the mothers that have to play the father's role.
Mm-hmm.
Happy Mother's Day to you too. Like I said before, we started our conversation a couple weeks ago on the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, and I'm going to let Kenner go ahead and wrap us up. And by the way, I'm James.
I'm Kenner.
And there we have it.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining. So just a brief recap from our previous show. Sorry about that technical difficulty a few seconds ago. Things happen. We're a bit rusty. It's been a couple weeks.
Yeah.
But so what the Council of Nicaea, it was ordained in 325 by the Emperor Constantine. A lot of people like to say, they are under the misconception that the Council of Nicaea actually is where they picked the canon or the books of the Bible. That is not true. That's not what the purpose of the Council of Nicaea was. There's a couple things: ecclesiastical writings, some dating with the calendars they wanted to sort out, but primarily it was due to a man named Arius, who is the spearhead of a controversy in the early church known as the Arian controversy. We're asking you guys to do the due diligence and look into that yourself and hit us with any questions you may have. But the Arian controversy was that Arius was under the belief, and he taught his people, because he was also a priest. He wasn't a bishop, but he was a priest. He taught his students and his people that Jesus was a created being, and that gained a little bit of traction with some people, and it led to a pretty good sized two schisms in the church. One was before the Council of Nicaea, and another one after the Council of Nicaea. But we'll get into that second one today. So that's basically the gist of it. Constantine wanted to unify Rome, and you can't have a unified Rome when you have several different versions of your national religion, so to speak. So he wanted to completely unify everyone under one doctrine, under one dogma, under one religious canon that could be, not because he believed one way or the other, which eventually he did lean one way more than the other, but because he just wanted peace in the kingdom. Because right before him, the emperor before Constantine was who? He's the guy. Anyway, he was a Diocletian. No, he was the one that was martyring people, killing people. So we're just coming off like 40 to 50
Diocletian.
years. Diocletian, that's what I thought. So Diocletian was emperor, and then they were martyring and killing Christians. Christians got blamed if anything ever went wrong. Christians were to blame for it.
They were feeding them to lions and
Right.
Colosseums.
Setting them on fire.
It was horrible.
Tearing them apart. We all know how some of the original 12 were martyred. Well, not all the original 12 were martyred, but most of them were martyred. But back to the Council of Nicaea, it was just a group of religious leaders who got together to try to bring everyone together so then they could go out and teach all the provinces the same thing instead of having multiple different things. And a big black eye to the early church was Arianism, and which was for things I mentioned earlier. I've got a little bit of stuff here, unless you want to go ahead and start and jump into things you found out, and we can kind of ping pong it, whatever you think.
Okay. From the last conversation, it seemed like you wanted to kind of not pinpoint, but like segue into this conversation based off of I made a comment about the all of those that attended the council, like just a few decades earlier, they were being persecuted and they were dying.
Just in that province, just in that province, not on the outskirts, because in Alexandria you had a Christian university and in Egypt, so it wasn't throughout all of the Roman province, just right there on the ground in Rome.
Okay. Still, they were being persecuted and they were dying for what they believed. So I think
under Diocletian.
Yeah, under Diocletian.
Right.
I will agree with that. So I think that's a good place to start. Is like like at the council and then post council.
Sure. Well, we have to understand that Constantine took office many years before the Council of Nicaea. So there was a cooling off period.
Like 311.
Yeah, right. So you've got over a decade of cooling off after all of the murders and all the killings and all of the atrocities that Christian believers were up to. But again, we have to be clear. In Alexandria, in Egypt, they had a university there that was, I mean, they were definitely under the control of Rome, but they were practicing freely, teaching freely. They didn't have any issues there. But in Rome and in some of these, especially like Jerusalem, right, where you have, I mean, that's the kind of the precipice of everything is Jerusalem, whether it's Islam or Christianity, but we'll just stick to Christianity for right now. And so it's important to note out that the members of the Council of Nicaea, most of whom were all converts. I mean, basically everybody, was converts other than direct descendants or direct pupils or pupils of the apostate fathers. But a lot of the people at the university in Alexandria were people who used to be Greek philosophers and who were converted. And their conversion brought them there to the University of Alexandria to learn the Christian doctrines, to see the ancient text and come up with a lot of stuff. And I actually found out something very interesting. Pamphilus, you've heard of him? Pamphilus.
No, I haven't.
So Pamphilus was...
Yes, I have.
He was one of the early people who started writing.
Where was that at? Like
That was in
Acts?
Alexandria.
No, I mean, like, is he mentioned in Acts?
No, that's a different one. That's a different guy. This guy is circa 320. This guy, well, he's like circa 280 to 320. Okay. Yeah, it's a different one. Yeah, and I should have wrote Pamphilus of whatever.
Okay, yeah.
But anyways, so
I'm not wrong, right?
You're right. There is a Pamphylia, yeah,
in the
and Priscilla and Aquila and Pamphylia, yeah. All of those people are mentioned in Acts.
Okay.
So just to be clear, yeah, I didn't want to put it in there. Sorry about that. I didn't write down where he was from. Nonetheless, as we get moving in here, Pamphilus was a teacher at this university. Who again, he was a philosopher, Greek mythology, yada yada, all that stuff, believed in the pantheon, all that, converted to Christianity, and his works were actually very, very important into the Septuagint writings, or some of his people before him that he followed were very big into the Septuagint writings, which I find odd because those aren't Christian writings. I don't understand that at all. But nonetheless, he had a pupil named Eusebius, and Eusebius' name is going to come up a lot. Eusebius of Alexandria was a bishop, an exegete, and apologist. He was a historian with the funny, and not so much funny, but the interesting thing about him, about Pamphilus, or about Eusebius, is that whenever he would do his writings, he would always add commentary in, like directly in instead of the most guys would do. He would write it directly in, but what he would also do is directly quote his source right there in the line. And some say that some of those direct sources are some of the earliest manuscripts that we actually have of the Christian faith. I don't know how they came up with that number, but that's what they're saying. But he wrote a book called The Ecclesiastical History. He started it in 312, finished it in 324, right before the Council of Nicaea. He actually supported Irenaeus, and he believed in his cause. He sided with him, which started the first schism.
So we are talking about Eusebius of Nicaea.
Of Alexandria.
I have
of Alexandria. The guy you're talking about.
The one that baptized.
That's the one that baptized him. Yeah, that's a different guy. But I would argue, though, that it's the same guy because of his views on Arianism, and he was also a bishop.
Well, there's another Eusebius.
There's a Eusebius of Alexandria, which was excommunicated, right? He was excommunicated. I'll get into that here shortly. But this Eusebius wrote a book called
Eusebius of
Caesarea. Caesarea, yeah. I said that's the Caesarea, and that's the same guy as Alexandria. Yeah,
okay, so that's what you're talking about.
That's what I'm talking about.
Now, what I'm saying is that the Eusebius of Nicaea is the one that agreed with Arius and would actually baptize him.
I think it's the same. I think it's the same guy.
Constantine.
I think it's the same guy because this guy also wrote the Ecclesiastical History, right, in 324. He supported Arius, and in 318 is when the Arian movement started making a lot of noise. In 318 AD, he was expelled from Alexandria Christian School, the university there, but Eusebius wrote to Alexander, who was kind of one of the leaders of the Council of Nicaea, and he told him that he wrote him to claim defense for Arius, that he's not being represented well, and you guys are just steamrolling him.
It is Nicaea.
Okay, that's the same guy from Caesarea?
No. Nicaea is the one that was an Arian.
Right, so is this guy.
And then
so is this guy.
Caesarea.
Yeah, so is this guy. Yeah, this guy was excommunicated. Let me just keep rolling here as you look for that.
Okay.
But this guy was Arius, Arius was under a lot of scrutiny from some of the big wigs, the big guns at the Council of Nicaea, and Eusebius actually wrote a letter to these guys saying, "Hey, listen, you guys are steamrolling this guy. He's being misrepresented. You're not taking his stuff in context." And Eusebius was kind of a politician. He kind of played both sides a little bit. But ultimately, there was a synod, an anti-Arian synod. And what a synod is a word for a bunch of religious leaders get together, an informal thing. They get together and they come up with certain laws or certain decrees or what could be labeled as heresy. But at this anti-Arian synod in Antioch in January of 325, the same year as the Council of Nicaea, Eusebius and two of his allies were excommunicated because they believe in defending the Arian viewpoint that Jesus was a created being. And what I find really interesting is that even though at the council of, or not the council, but right here at this Arian Synod of Antioch in January of 325, Eusebius and two of his allies were excommunicated by the majority church leaders, right? And the funny thing is, at the Council of Nicaea itself, Eusebius was actually reinstated to his bishop role. So he was excommunicated, and then Constantine got involved and said, no, let's hear this out. And he was able to give himself a full defense in front of everyone, instead of just being railroaded like a formal setting, right? And Constantine ultimately brought him back into the fold. And ironically enough, not too long after this, this same Eusebius, who was excommunicated and reinstated, he actually excommunicated Saint Eustachius and Saint Athanasius. He was in charge of expelling two of the people who were going after the original controversy. I find that very, very interesting.
What time are we talking about?
This would have been probably right after the Council of Nicaea. I would say right after the Council of Nicaea. I've got it right here.
Okay, well, let's walk back then.
Sure.
That's a good place to
Sure.
start. Let's start. Okay, so let me see. Let's start at the creed, right? So this creed was made, right?
Mm-hmm.
The Nicene Creed.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have that pulled up anywhere? Do you have that in your notes?
The Nicene Creed?
All of it.
Yeah. I mean, the Nicene Creed was just what the majority people of the Council of Nicaea came together in order.
I kind of wanted them to see.
Okay.
But I can look it up real quick, but
sure.
All right. So at this council, towards the end of it, after they had gone through scripture after scripture and debated with one another, Arius against Alexander against Arius, like everyone on this camp and everyone on this camp, like going through the scriptures, I'm not saying they came to a consensus, because it wasn't like that. It was, I don't, and based off what Kenner has been saying, like Arius didn't give up. His camp didn't give up. But what came out of the Council of Nicaea was the Nicene Creed. And it basically was a condemnation to Arius. It was kind of like to his face and his teachings. And it was also like a confirmation to the Orthodox view. And out of that, I think I mentioned that this is the last time we were talking, like everyone that showed up, all but Arius and about two bishops, signed the creed. And then we have Arius being exiled, being kicked out. And one of these things that I found really, really interesting, as they were discussing and debating one another and reasoning with one another, is that the Orthodox view. So they pointed out that that Arius's views had to be wrong because it was new and was not taught in early church history. Okay, I find that problematic. Do I agree with that? Do I agree that his views are wrong? I do agree that his views are wrong. But I don't agree with the fact that the Orthodox view is that his views had to be wrong.
Right.
They were so wrong because it was new and it was not taught in the early church history. And I kind of find that problematic because it's almost arguing from silence. Just because it wasn't mentioned before this point doesn't necessarily mean that it's not true. So I just found that kind of interesting, and I just wanted to bring that up. But
Yeah, the biggest claim from Arianism, which I don't agree with a lot of his conclusions that he made. I do agree with some, however. If you take the text for what it says, um, he's saying that the Son is subservient to the Father. Right? The Son is different from the Father. There's not a Godhead. The Godhead was actually, the Trinity was a major topic of discussion at the Council of Nicaea. The Trinity. That was a big one at the Council of Nicaea. It was. And then because if everyone could get behind that, now you've got a coalition of people who all think of the same way, which disproves Arianism. Because Arianism says they're not the same. They're completely different. One's created being, one is not. And there's all kinds of talk about, well,
I agree with you that like it was a topic. It wasn't the main topic. It was basically
it was the main topic.
The deity of Christ.
Right. Well, Arianism. Okay, so Arianism is just trying to say that Jesus is subservient to God. Okay. Some will argue that Arianism goes as far as saying that he's not even deity, right? Because only something that is uncreated can be deity, which I find ironic because even angels and stuff like that are considered deity, right? Like even in the Catholic Church themselves, they pray to the saints who are somewhat deity, right? In a sense, a spiritual deity. In a sense.
Do they pray to them as deities or just divine figures?
Well, okay. What's the difference? I think that's a very fair question, but I would ask you, what is the difference between those two?
Because I've always thought, without looking it up, I've always thought that deity is God, the creator.
No,
but a divine figure.
In Psalm 82, God sits in the divine council and casts judgment on the lower gods. Right. So these lower gods are obviously created beings.
Right.
So they're obviously God's calling them deity. Right. They're just little g gods. I think you've got different levels to it.
Oh, well, you're talking about gods, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm talking about the actual word deity as opposed to the word divine figure or divinity.
Mm-hmm.
And deity are completely separate things, and you use them separately. You use deity talking about God.
Would you say Jesus is a divine figure?
Yes, but I also think that the angels are divine figures.
Okay, so that's what I'm saying. But angels are also created. Right, or angels are created, so it can be interchangeable.
Right, but I think you can use divine figure with Jesus and the angels, but you can't use deity with Jesus and the angels. You can only use it with Jesus.
I guess it depends on your view of deity.
You can't use deity for angels.
I guess it depends on your
figure for angels.
And I think it depends on your version, on your interpretation of what the word deity means.
Right.
Does deity mean there's only one God, one deity? So what about the lowercase gods? Are those divine figures? Right?
To me, in my head, deity is what created us and what we worship.
Yeah, I got a different viewpoint. I mean, that's a fair assumption. But I would say if you're called a God and you are worshipped, I would say, even if you look up the word theos,
right? I mean, if you're a God and you are worshipped, I don't worship the angels.
And at the Tower of Babel, God gave people over to worship the host of heaven, right? He scattered them to the nations. So obviously, God handed over humanity, and we're getting a little bit off course here, but that's fine. That's what we do here. But we also have a show on the Tower of Babel where God disinherited, mankind after their rebellion, which was right after 2-3 generations after the flood, somewhere in there, something like that. But I just find it interesting. But the big thing with Arianism was he was saying that Jesus, according to the text, was subservient to the Father, meaning he was under the Father. And it's in a hierarchy sense. Because to them, you look at the way the early Catholic Church was formed with these guys, everything's hierarchy. You've got Pope and then bishops, and you've got cardinals, and you've got all these other guys. So it's a very hierarchical type thing, which ironically enough is exactly how the Greek Pantheon is. You know what I mean? So it's really, really interesting how a bunch of Greek philosophers who converted to Christianity put together Christianity in a way that looks very similar to the Greek Parthenon, like how you've got this God, these gods, these leaders here on earth. It's very, very interesting. I'm not saying there's a direct connection. and I don't think you'll ever be able
To the church?
To the church, yes.
To the Roman Catholic Church?
Yes, because the ones that are right here at the Council of Nicaea. Because these guys, originally there was just one church, right? There was one church,
Right.
and they kept breaking off from each other. I don't agree with what you say here. I don't agree with what you say here. And the funny thing about the Council of Nicaea is that ultimately the Trinitarian viewpoint won, right? And Arianism was deemed heresy. But ironically enough, a few short years later, the same guys who they kicked out of the church came back in and then kicked those guys out of the church. And the same guys who kicked them out of the church, some would argue, is the same guy who baptized Constantine. Some say that Nicomedia, Alexandria, or the Caesarea guy of Eusebius is the same guy.
Okay, so are we? What churches are we talking about? Like, I mean, like in areas I'm talking about, So we have, of course, we have Constantine in Rome.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then we have like all these other places where there's all these other churches. What you're talking about? This person being kicked out here, and where are we talking about?
Well, we're talking about strictly after the Council of Nicaea. The early church started immediately after the crucifixion of Jesus.
I agree.
Like immediately after. We're talking 300 years prior to this.
Yeah.
So that when I mention early church in this context, I'm specifically talking about the Council of Nicaea time frame on. I'm not talking about how James was
the true early church.
Right, the true early church was, James, the brother of Jesus.
After this.
Right. James, the brother of Jesus, Peter, all those other guys who went out and started
churches.
Right.
Started planting
Right.
churches here again.
Those were the very first churches.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Now,
because that's where a lot of Paul's letters, they were.
Exactly,
They
to the churches. And the book of Revelation, John writes to the churches as well. Right. Those are the original, I guess you call them localized churches. But when we're in this context, when we say early church, we're specifically speaking of the Council of Nicaea and Constantine's wishes to unify Rome and make it a national church. See what I'm saying? There's a distinction there. So
where are you getting that he wanted to actually? I know he wanted to unify. Where are you getting that he wanted a universal kind of, so to speak, a church? Like a nationwide church, or
that's the only reason why. That's the only reason why he ordained the Council of Nicaea, was to have a national church that all of Rome could be under the same rules, not have different sect here with different viewpoints here. He wanted everything to be the same to unify the
within the church, because
within the new church.
It went to him that Arius and Alexander were having this beef. Mm-hmm. So he wanted that beef to be swallowed because he didn't want that to get out.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right.
But it wasn't that like he wanted a universal one religion for the empire. He just wanted Christians to get their stuff together. That's what he wanted.
Well, he was Christian himself.
I get it.
Constantine was Christian himself.
He wanted the Christians to get their stuff together. Mm-hmm. He didn't want there to be one religion for the entire empire.
I would argue that he did.
I would argue that he did. I would argue.
And what is your proof that he did?
What is your proof that he did?
Well, so if you go to the Britannica, which I know you like to cite a lot, right?
I do.
If you go to the Britannica and you put in reasons Constantine wanted to unify Rome.
I'm going to keep using Google.
So there was several civil wars in Rome, right? It wasn't all religious, but majority of it was religious. There were lots of wars bad for business, and Rome is built on taxes. And if everybody's fighting with each other and there's bloodshed, which has actually been the playbook of all Roman emperors in the region.
Right.
They always said, what's bad for business. Like Pilate himself was under strict orders not to have another uprising.
Okay.
Which is why he was able to be manipulated by the Sanhedrin at the crucifixion of Christ. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So Constantine wanted to unify Rome. And I think a fair assumption would be to say, and one way to do that would be to have one state religion. I mean, you can worship freely, worship whatever you want.
Right.
But as far as it comes to the Christians, which he himself was a Christian, he wanted there to be no opposition from each other. He didn't, because that means if these people believe one thing and these people believe a different thing, now we've got the same situation we had 300 years before between the Jews and the Christians, and they're at war, and it's bad for business, lots of bloodshed, lots of dying, cities burning down. They wanted to stop that. They wanted to be the center of trade for the world. And he ordained the Council of Nicaea. One of the reasons why he did that was so he could unify. I would say the major contributing factor would be that he could do that. He himself was obviously vested in the Christian faith, because not only did he want to get everybody together to all agree on the same set of principles, but he also took a very keen interest in Eusebius.
Right.
This Eusebius I was mentioning earlier, because Eusebius was ultimately excommunicated by the Council of Nicaea.
Yeah.
And ironically enough, a few short years later, he was reinstated by Constantine himself.
Mm-hmm.
And then that newly reinstated Eusebius excommunicated two of the people who went after Arianism at the Council of Nicaea. And ironically enough, some would argue that an Arian bishop named Eusebius, whether it's the same Eusebius or not, we don't know that.
There's two of them.
Sure.
There's probably more.
There's probably like more, right? But as far as as far as being the Eusebius I'm speaking of pre-Constantine's death. Whether or not it's the same guy or not, I would say it's the same guy, because, like I just mentioned before, he went to bat for him and said, "No, you reinstate him." He then let him excommunicate two of the people who went after the Arians at the Nicene Creed, and not only that, he also commissioned Eusebius to give him 50 copies of the new canon.
Mm-hmm.
And that wasn't until sometime later. But another interesting fun fact is, a few years later, maybe 40, 60 years later, at the Council of Constantinople, they actually revised the Council of the Nicene Creed. It got revised. So I don't know if it had anything directly to do with Arianism or not. I don't know. But it'd be interesting to see when Constantine died, see if that coincided with the Council of Constantinople.
Now, I do have written down in my notes that there was a Eusebius
Mm-hmm.
that was at the council. That there was actually three groups in the council. There was Arius and his camp,
Mm-hmm.
with Orthodox viewpoint, and then there was the Eusebian group, and this was Eusebius of Caesarea.
Mm-hmm. Same guy of Alexandria, same guy.
He basically, him and his group, they believed similarly to what the Orthodox group was, that Jesus was fully God, existed eternally with the Father, and they only disagreed on the use of the word homoousis, and that's why we consider it three different groups there. Like basically,
So why was he excommunicated? That's the only
I don't know.
that he got. Well, he was excommunicated because he sided with Arian. That's why he was excommunicated, because
after the council, right? We're talking about after the council. Because I don't believe Eusebius was on board at the end of the council.
No, he got reinstated at the Council of Nicaea. He got kicked out. So he got kicked out here in January of 325. And then the council was in the same year. Then he got reinstated by Constantine himself at the Council of Nicaea.
When he
He got kicked out because
the council.
Right. Well, so they had an anti-Arian synod in Antioch just months before the Council of Nicaea. And all these guys got together and said, Arian's out, you support him, you're out. Well, at this synod, which was getting together and making all rules in Antioch, mind you, were Christians in the book of Acts. So that was kind of a big religious place in the early Christian faith with Antioch. But Eusebius and two of his allies were excommunicated. And I think that's interesting. And then he's excommunicated for, I don't know what it was, but I say 7 months maybe from him getting excommunicated. he was reinstated.
Well, the council was in, I believe, August.
Okay, so
Yeah.
so 7 months.
He called it in June. Maybe it was June. I feel like June is a big.
Sure, but anyway, it was in the same year.
year.
He was kicked out in January and reinstated at the council.
Okay.
Yeah, and the criticizers of the Arian controversy was Saint Athanasius and Saint Eustachius and Alexander, who was the head of that whole little conglomerate of people. He didn't get kicked out because he was too powerful, but the other two were excommunicated. And then I got
your thing before the council.
After the council.
After the
council.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, or it could have been at the council. Honestly, I didn't read.
It was only Arius and 2 bishops that got exiled or kicked out at the council.
So at the Council of Nicaea, so Arius and his 2 bishops that are not Arius, but Eusebius of Caesarea and 2 of his cohorts, his allies, whatever you want to call them, they were kicked out at the Arian Synod of Antioch in January of 325. Then Eusebius was reinstated by Constantine himself. I don't know if that was at the council. I don't know if that was after. I would say it was probably after the council, because I don't think Constantine was at the council. I don't know, but you can look up and see when was Eusebius of Caesarea reinstated.
Hey, why don't you look up that?
Sure.
While you're looking that up, I googled the reason for Constantine, since we were at odds about that. Google, Professor Google says Emperor Constantine called the Council of Nicaea primarily to resolve the theological dispute known as Arianism. This heresy, proposed by Arius of Alexandria, questioned the divinity of Jesus Christ, arguing he was a created being rather than being of the same substance as God the Father. Constantine, seeking the unity within the Roman Empire, hoped the council would establish a unified Christian doctrine and quell the controversy.
You're right, but like I said, that was the main reason Constantine wanted to get everybody together, because there was a schism in the Christian church between Arianism and the Trinitarian view.
Right.
And he wanted to squelch that.
But I looked that up because you had said that Constantine wanted a one-state religion. And I
think that's right. I think that's right.
I was pushing back.
Well, no, but I think that solidifies my point, because he didn't want the religion of Rome, which Constantine said is Christianity. Constantine himself said Rome is going to be Christian when they say he looked up and seen the cross in the sky or whatever. And whether or not that actually happens, neither here nor there. But anyways,
I think he was Christian at that point. If that story even happens, I think he was Christian at that point. But I don't think his intention was to ever have a state religion. That's my point. Is like the Council of Nicaea, and I don't even know if it was Constantine's will at all, was to make one state religion that went across the empire.
I would say just one version of Christianity.
His whole purpose for calling this council was to quell the dispute that Arius and Alexander had within the church of
the Christian church
within Alexandria, but not to make it like the church of Rome, of the Roman Empire, I should say. Not to make it the church of the Roman Empire, but to just solve their little beef.
So you're saying it was primarily called just to solve the beef of what was going on in Egypt?
Yes, that's what I'm saying.
I don't think that's true. I don't think that's true at all.
Because I
don't think that's true at all.
Because it was causing disruption within the empire.
Right. Not
but that's different than solving their issue is not the same as like, well, because you guys have figured it out, it's going to be the religion of Rome, the Roman Empire. That's not what.
So where was Constantine based at?
He was in Rome.
Rome, right. He's in Rome. And where is the Arian controversy stemming from? Alexandria. Okay. Where are all these guys at the Council of Nicaea primarily from? Rome.
All over.
Mostly Rome.
All over the empire. Not mostly Rome.
I understand.
Not mostly Rome, the Roman Empire.
Right, but my point is the Roman church, like Rome, when it was officially turned into the capital of Christianity, like the Roman Catholic Church, Rome is the center of it all.
Right.
So we got to get our bishops and our people as the authoritative view on this issue, not some little church school in Alexandria, because the school.
But that's exactly what it was. That's exactly right. That's exactly what happened.
But
it was some school church in Alexandria. It was the city of Alexandria
that was gaining
having
traction.
the problem. That was having the problem because Arius was getting big and he was getting pushback from Alexander.
Right, and Alexander was from where?
Alexandria.
Okay.
Alexander.
Right, but he was representing Rome. He was in Rome. He was in Rome. Like those guys were bishops. They were organizing the early church, setting up who's going to be the hierarchy in Rome. None of this stuff was done in Alexandria.
Yes, it was. It was in Alexandria.
So
this caught his attention all the way from Alexandria.
Caught whose attention?
Constantine.
Okay, and who went to Constantine?
Who went to him?
Yes, the bishops who were opposing.
Oh, you mean during the council?
But pre-council. Everyone
I understand
pre-council.
what you mean.
So at the Council of Nicaea, you've got you've got priests and bishops from all over the region, right? The ones that were being represented by Alexandria, like the school, was the teachers that were there. The teachers were at odds with some of the bishops. The teachers were saying, you guys are doing this wrong. Jesus is not God. And then he came back and they had a war saying, this is wrong, we're going to squelch it out. Then they actually both went to Rome to talk to Constantine. And Constantine actually sided with the Arian viewpoint personally. But as far as to make matters, calm the waters, he let the majority, he let democracy win the day. If more people wanted it to be this way, it was going to be this way. And there's proof of that because after the Arian people were excommunicated, Constantine stepped in and let them back in.
Okay. To what you just said, just to jump off of what you just said, I have written in my notes, Constantine presided over the council, but did not push any particular
He didn't push his
views.
doctrine, right.
So, I mean, how is he pushing Arianism if he's...
I'm not saying he's pushing Arianism. I'm saying he was sympathetic toward the Arian viewpoints. I think he's personally sided with them.
Like later, yeah, I agree with you. I understand that, but I'm back to my original, what I'm pushing back against you is that the purpose of the council was not to have one church for the Roman Empire.
It was to have one Christian church, not several different denominations of the Christian church. It was to have one Christian church. And you were able to worship freely in Rome.
Right.
But once it became the Roman Catholic Church, that's it. No Muslims, none of this Greek mythology crap.
The Muslims wasn't even a thing.
No, I understand. Or Persians or any of those types of gods. You know what I mean? Not the Muslims, but Muslims call themselves descendants from Persians. Right? So, which is ironic because, and it is interesting, we could get into that too sometime. It is interesting how King Xerxes actually said, God has told me to let you go build his temple. I find that interesting too. But that's just for another show. But all I'm trying to say is, there's no way to know for sure if Constantine said, we want one national religion and we're going to shove it down your neck. You guys get me something together, right? So that we can end all this controversy. Because I've got these religious leaders here, these bishops, the majority of them are saying that this Arian guy and his viewpoints are wrong. So we need to get together and see what happens. They got together, but before the Council of Nicaea, they got together in Antioch, and it was the sole purpose of this meeting in Antioch in January of 325 was to formulate a plan to squash out Arianism at the Council of Nicaea. It was like a pre-game. You know what I mean? It was like, let's get together and figure out what we're going to do when the big game finally comes here. And whether or not Constantine said, we can speculate on whether or not he wanted it to be a national thing. Look, it eventually turned into a national thing a few years later. So whether or not that was his initial intentions or not, who knows? Who cares? But one thing we know for sure, He definitely wanted to unify the Christian faith and not have all these different sects. And these different sects have been fighting with each other since the day Jesus Christ was resurrected.
I get that. I understand what you're saying.
And they wanted to end all of that.
Yeah, I get that. Like he wanted unity, but he didn't want that to be the standard.
Well,
I don't think he wanted it to be the standard.
but here's the thing. Look at the evidence. Look at what happened. Ultimately, it became the standard.
Yeah,
right.
But not because of Constantine.
Hang on. It was solely because of Constantine.
I disagree.
So I'm saying he set the groundwork. He didn't have his hands in it.
Right.
I'm just saying he ordered. Dude, Constantine wanted a religious canon for Christianity spread throughout Rome. He commissioned this same Eusebius of Caesarea to commission.
He wanted a canon, but we already had the canon.
No, we didn't have the canon.
We didn't have the canon.
No. Okay, see, you're talking about two different churches. You're talking about the early church in Jerusalem and all of those guys. Right. Yes, they had Paul's letters. They had all this other stuff. But when it became coming to the national stage, when it was becoming the Roman Catholic Church,
right,
then they had their greatest Greek philosophers who converted. All the smart men came around, and they all got together to try to come up with a canon, which that was after the Council of Nicaea.
In 380, right?
In 380, yeah, some of it, yeah. That was a Constantinople.
But how much different was that canon in 380 than the canon that was already established by 325?
Okay, but established by who? Established by who? You're talking about a few local churches, right? Like in Jerusalem and Antioch and all these other little places throughout the Bible where Jesus' message would have been preached personally. That's the early church. We're conflating both of these, and we're trying. I want to draw a distinction between the early Church of Christ, which had nothing to do with Rome, nothing.
Right.
The early church, right? Okay, but when Constantine got involved, that started the snowball that eventually became the Roman Catholic Church. Okay, so whether or not it happened during his lifetime or shortly after his lifetime, that's irrelevant. The point is, it gained traction at the Council of Nicaea. Those were the beginning workings of the organized Roman Catholic Church.
Okay.
And I believe that was part of his plan all along.
But what my question is that, okay, before Council of Nicaea, let's go back even 50 to 100 years before the council.
Okay.
There was a canon that the churches used, right?
Okay, which one are you talking about? Are you talking about the canon that was
the New Testament?
Okay, there wasn't a no.
What New Testament canon?
There was no canon. All you had was a collection of letters. It wasn't until that one bishop said, "This is canon. I think this is out. This is out. This is out."
By
there was
200 AD, there was a canon,
not compiled like how we know it today as the canon.
I get that. So
right.
What was that?
Right.
And how is it that much different than what happened in, let's say, by 380?
I would say it's probably 99% exactly the same. The only problem was Jesus God or not? Was Jesus God or not? That's always been the problem in Christianity. Is Jesus God or not? You know what I mean? That's the only difference between the early church fathers. Now, I mean, some would argue that the Greek philosophers kind of snuck in some of the Greek, pantheon or whatever, however you want to call it, into the Catholic Church. But there is a lot of evidence of that. But nonetheless, the core message would have obviously been absorbed by Palestinian Jews or Jews of the region or Gentiles who converted or people who saw Jesus' miracles. So obviously you got those types of early church people. Then 300 some odd years later, you have these politicians getting involved and saying, this is what it's going to be. And if you disagree with us, you're dead. Because before that, you had Peter and Paul at odds with each other, and it was just left up to the interpretation of the reader. But now that Constantine got involved, and I believe that he wanted to nationalize the religion, because ultimately that's what happened because of all of this. You know what I mean? So whether or not it's written down that he wanted this to be a national religion or was going to force feed it down people's throat, I don't know. And frankly, I don't care, because my version of Christianity does not come from the Nicene Creed. My version of Christianity comes from eyewitness accounts of Jesus and what his people say that they, or what Paul said that he showed him. These guys are interpreting what it says, and it's not very clear. Let's be frank. Even today, we know that there's some things that can definitely be argued, but these guys were trying to solve, and that's how you know that the Greeks got into it. These guys are trying to solve the mystery of Jesus instead of leaving it up to a personal relationship with Christ.
Okay, so you said a lot.
Sure.
You said a lot. Okay.
Sure.
The last thing that you said is that you aren't getting your definition of Christianity by the Nicene Creed, but by what?
By the Gospels and the Paul's letters themselves.
That's what they were using.
I understand, but the point I'm trying to make is they're taking one. There's two different sides here.
Right?
Is Jesus God or is he not God? Constantine wants to unify Christianity, and the majority of the people think one way, but these scholars over here think another way. These other guys are just politicians, people who have money, people who are elected popes to rule over.
And also scholars. Like
there were
some scholars.
There were some.
We can't say that this new opposing view is only from the scholars, and like these laymen and these non-scholars are.
I didn't mean to suggest that at all. I didn't mean to suggest that at all, because a lot of these guys at the council, especially this guy here, Saint Athanasius and Saint Eustachius, they were actually students of the same.
Weren't they like scholars?
You're right. I'm saying they were students of the same school that brought you Arianism. They were just in the know with all, or they were just in the in crowd with all the bishops, the religious leaders, which I call modern day Pharisees and Sadducees. That's how I look at those types. But anyways, they're the in crowd. Constantine wants us to unify this thing. There's only a few people over here who believe this, and some of the people at the council agreed with the Arian controversy. They agreed with Arianism, but they sided with the other side just so they could just get an answer to Constantine, just so this thing can be squelched, just so they can now.
Or maybe they just believed.
Well, I don't think that that's true, because it was very easy for Arianism to creep back up into the hierarchy of the bishops shortly after the Nicene Creed. If all these people believed that, they would have snuffed it out and left it out. But that thing crept so much so that Constantine himself was baptized by an Arian bishop.
Well, I had that Arius was exiled and fled to Iridium.
Arius, yes.
But his teaching began to spread and gain political power, especially on Constantine's sister Constantia, and her deathbed, and urged him to support Arius, which he did.
Sure.
Which
probably led to why he reinstated Eusebius. I don't know where the dates are, but to me that makes more sense with what you said, with why he would start showing more favoritism toward Arius. But it's not clear,
because like his follower that you see, I think it's the same Eusebius that you were talking about. I have it written down as Eusebius of Nicaea.
I think it's the same
Nicaea.
No, they're two different people.
But like his follower Eusebius of Nicaea was able to sway Constantine more in favor of the Arian view, baptized him on his deathbed.
Yeah, but this is 50 years later.
Yeah, basically solidifying him siding with Arius.
Right, but this is 50 years later, though. You know what I mean? His deathbed, whenever he died. This is long after the Council of Nicaea. I think he was swayed by Eusebius way before that. Way before that. I believe he was, because why would he order him to be reinstated right in front of him? Right, when everybody else said he's out.
I don't believe that either. I don't believe that it was just like on his deathbed. It's like, I guess I believe it. No, it was before that. But I'm just saying that like the nail in the coffin, no pun intended, was like, on his deathbed. It was, it was that way.
Yeah, I see it that way. I think you're right about that. I think, but to be honest, I don't think Constantine cared. You know what I mean? I don't think he cared. I don't think he just wanted peace. And the only way to do that, if I'm ruling a nation, I'm not Constantine, but if I'm ruling a people and 70% of my people believe one way, and they live peacefully together.
Right.
The only time there's issues is when this other 30% comes around.
Mm-hmm.
We're wiping that other 30% out of here.
Yeah.
Because that's bad for business. You know what I mean? Like that's what you would have to do. You know,
Right.
or you set up freedom of religion like we did here in the States, but you can't call yourself Christian. And I believe this was Constantine's view all along. If you're going to be called a Christian, you're going to follow our interpretation of what Christianity is. And our interpretation of what Christianity is the Roman Catholic Bible and those interpretations.
But okay, so like there was this viewpoint
Mm-hmm.
before the council.
Mm-hmm.
There was already scripture.
Sure.
And there was already a viewpoint before the council even.
Right.
They were actually trying to figure this out. So the majority.
No, these guys were trying to figure it
That's
out.
what I mean.
The other guys had it figured out.
Yeah, they had it.
These guys are taking a Jewish transitional religion called Christianity that's got nothing to do with Rome. These guys are saying they're now trying to say, we're going to take your religion and tell you what to do with it. I believe that that's what happened. I honestly do. I think they had good intentions. I don't think it was all, it was any type. I think a lot of these guys were true believers, but I think mostly, even if you look at the history of the Vatican, mostly it was all power, money, and control. That's it.
Okay. I just Googled this.
Mhm.
The earliest known Christian church in Egypt is believed to be St. Mark's Coptic Orthodox Cathedral
Right.
in Alexandria.
That's the same place these guys went to.
Founded around 42 AD
By Mark.
by St. Mark,
Right.
the Apostle.
Right.
So this viewpoint about Jesus has been there from the very beginning. And then Arius comes around saying something completely different.
What viewpoint was different?
Alexander,
As far as
that Orthodox view that
The-
Alexander of Alexandria and his camp agreed with Athanasius, Hosias of Cordova,
sure.
like
Right, but all of these guys you're quoting are Greek people who were taught the religion. I'm talking about the early church of the people who seen Jesus. The church that James presided over looks nothing like the church.
This church
in
in
Alexandria.
particular was founded in
It
42,
was okay. Listen, that is
like 10 years after Jesus.
that can't be right.
42
that can't be right.
80 by St. Mark.
That can't be right. That's Roman legend. That can't be right, because
Why
if
can't it be
if that's the case, then Mark's gospel is before Paul's letters. That can't be the case. That can't be the case. Mark didn't even start writing until what, 90?
Why would his gospel have to be before?
The
Well,
point I'm
right.
trying to make is the earliest gospel that we have is probably Mark, right? It's probably Mark.
Probably.
But when did Mark start writing? You're telling me that he founded this religion or this church before he wrote the book of Mark?
why is
No,
that?
I don't see
Why
that.
not? I mean, why not?
Because,
it was all oral tradition.
Okay, but
we
hang on a minute.
didn't have the New Testament after that. Why is that so hard to believe that like he founded a church? They all founded a church. Like the church was founded before even Paul's letters. Because what are you writing to if the letter, the scripture comes before the church?
Sure, no, I understand that. The churches were established. James was the supposed leader of the church. The first place people were called Christians was where? Antioch, right. So, and Jerusalem was the center of all of that back in Jesus' time.
Right.
If you're telling me that Mark founded this thing 10
Founded a
years
church.
10 years after Jesus's, okay, what proof is there that he founded that church at that time? Like there's like Mark's own God, like he was supposedly with Paul. Mark was supposedly with Paul. He was supposedly Peter's translator. You know what I mean? That's an argument that people have. So how would he have gone over here 10 years after? When was Mark writing? When would Mark have gotten this information?
I don't know. What do you mean? When did
Mark obviously happened way after the disciples. Obviously.
Mark,
Had to.
Mark, what are you talking about? Mark happened like his gospel, or like what are you saying?
No, so Mark wrote his gospel, but before he wrote his gospel, he was around Peter, he
And
was
Paul.
around Paul. Right, that's what I'm saying.
Right.
Paul is the earliest New Testament writer we have.
Okay.
So I believe Mark is taking stuff from Peter, from Paul,
Okay.
and then he wrote. I can't see him establishing a church without first establishing his gospel. Because what authority does he have? Mark has no authority other than being a gospel in the Bible, a secondhand account of what happened.
Right, but like
Jesus.
to establish a church, he didn't have to write the gospel down first before establishing a church.
Okay, so what authority would he have had to go found a
Like
church?
you go and you tell them about Jesus Christ,
Hold
and
on.
you get believers, and
I understand.
you build a church. I don't
The-
understand what you're saying.
The first hierarchy was set up by Jesus's disciples, right? Not the one at Rome. The first early church was set up by those guys,
Right,
right?
I get it.
Now,
I understand.
so-
but did they have writings before that?
I bet they did.
I don't think so.
Well,
I don't think.
Did they have writings?
I'm not understanding your.
Did they have
correlation
writings before
between
what?
Trying to have that they would have to have a writing of some sort before they can establish a church. I'm not understanding.
I'm not saying that at all, because obviously James the Just was the leader of the Jerusalem church before any of
All right, well, let's not talk about him. We're talking about
Right.
Mark. Like, why do you think that Mark needed to write a gospel
I'm-
before he could establish?
What
a
I'm
church?
saying, I'm not saying that at all. I'm not saying that is a prerequisite to starting a church. What I am saying is, who would have given him the authority to do that?
He was going around, like you said, he was going around with
Mhm.
Peter. He was going around with Paul. He was going around with who was with Paul a lot? Silas.
Okay, so
He
when
was going around with Silas
Sure.
and
Sure.
what's the other? Barnabas.
sure, I understand that.
All of those.
But
people.
who would have given Paul the authority to ordain Mark as anything? The disciples didn't consider Paul anything. They were at odds with him. It wasn't until later in the book of Acts, which it actually happened first before the Gospels. But nonetheless, I mean, it was written down first. But nonetheless, who?
Well,
gave-
maybe we need to deep dive into Acts
Sure. I'm
because
curious.
Mark is mentioned a lot, and isn't it the one that Mark kind of flaked out a little bit, and that made
a little bit.
a rift between Paul
Right.
and
Because he wasn't there.
Barnabas, I
Right,
believe?
because he wasn't there to do the work. Right.
And then
Yeah.
but then later Mark did a complete 180,
Mm-hmm.
and then Paul was like, yeah, Mark,
Mhm. Good job.
good job, Mark.
Yeah.
So I don't see
Sure.
an issue with Google saying that the church was founded, Mark's church, the earliest church known in Egypt is 42 AD.
Mm-hmm.
I don't.
Right.
feel comfortable with
I know that that's there, and that doesn't hold any water here nor there for me at all. I'm not talking about the Greeks spreading the gospel. I don't care about that.
Mm.
I'm talking about the early church, the early Jews who started believing in Christianity,
Mhm.
which told their story to the Greeks, and then the Greeks went out and did their thing. I'm talking about.
But wasn't Mark half Greek?
Mark was probably fully Greek.
I think that
Mark was probably fully. He
it
spoke
was
both
either,
languages.
it was either Mark or Timothy. I can't remember which one, but one of them had a Jewish mother and a Greek father.
Yeah, I'm not. I mean, what's the point of that?
Well, because if he was Greek,
Mhm.
if he was half Greek and half
Mhm.
Jewish, that makes perfect sense. Him starting a church.
I
Because
can't get there. I can't get there
Like,
just on that.
I'm not understanding why you're saying that. These Greeks don't know what the early Jews were talking, and it seems like at 42 AD,
I don't believe
they
that
should have
date's
known.
accurate. I don't believe that could any way possibly be
Well,
accurate.
then, I mean,
I don't.
you got to be consistent though.
Sure.
We can't use Google one moment and it's
I'm
accurate, and then,
I'm totally okay with him starting the church. I'm totally okay with that. But I'm not. I just the date just doesn't make sense to me at all. You know, there's no way. I mean, I know that Mark is our earliest gospel.
Uh-huh.
You know, I do know that as far as the copies that we have, Mark is probably the earliest gospel. But Paul is,
According to the tradition, Saint Mark, one of the 12 apostles,
but see, he wasn't. That's what I'm saying.
he wasn't one of the
That's
12.
what I'm saying. That's complete
He
rubbish.
wasn't one of the 12.
That's
He wasn't
garbage.
the 12, but he was an
But
apostle.
my point is the same
Arrived
guy
in
that,
Alexandria around 42.
the same thing that's telling you that it was in 42 is telling you that Mark was an apostle. That's not accurate at all. He could have been a disciple of one of the apostolic fathers. I would buy that, but definitely wasn't an apostle. I mean, that's quite
Okay, but here's the thing. So, when do you think that he established the church?
I personally, we have to look at the life of Mark. Like, was Mark martyred?
Yeah,
No.
he was martyred in 68. So, like,
He was martyred in 68.
so from
Where was he
33,
martyred?
33 and 68, he had to establish the church at between that point.
No, because Paul doesn't even start till like 5 years after Jesus crucified, and Mark learned everything he
But
learned
I'm saying
Paul.
from Jesus to 68,
Mhm.
33 to
Mhm.
68, at
Mhm.
some point, Mark had to have started the church.
I mean, he could have.
You can't start it after you're martyred. You can't
No.
start
I'm saying he could have started it. The debate is whether or not Mark himself did that, or whether or not the Catholic Church says that Mark himself did that. That's the difference. You know what I mean? If you look up Josephus, how come all these other Christian historians aren't saying these things?
But you said at the beginning of this that Mark started this church,
Mhm.
and now
He
you're
did.
like,
No.
maybe-
I'm saying the date is wrong. I'm saying there's no way he could have started
But
that in 42.
If he was martyred in 68,
Mm-hmm.
the church had to have been started in between.
Agreed. I agree. I agree.
Whether it's 35, whether it's 47,
I would say probably
or
closer. I
67.
would say closer to in between 40 and 55. I would say somewhere in there because the whole book of Acts, all of that covers a 10-year period of Paul going here, Paul going there. So there's no way. I mean, unless Paul just forgot to mention that, obviously it had to be done after Acts. That's the point I'm trying to make. And Acts, we have a definite time from when the book of Acts was made and when these events took place, right? Jesus appeared to Paul 3 years after his resurrection, right? On the road to Damascus. That's when Jesus appeared to Paul, or Saul at the time, Saul, right? So then you start the 10-year journey of Paul, which I don't even think it ended in his beheading at all. That's not biblical.
I think my whole point that I brought that up was because I kind of lost what I was even what my point was, but I think it was that leading up to the council, the Christian doctrine was already established,
but not completely agreed upon. Okay, how about this? Is this a fair way to say it? The Christian doctrine was already established. We had Paul's letters. We have the Gospels. That was already established. We can agree with that. But we did not have the other Gospels. See, that's what I'm saying. If you're telling me that this place that's preaching Christian theology with the Gospels, with the doctrine, dude, Matthew didn't even write till 70 AD, 80 AD. So how Matthew,
Okay.
any of them, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, any of them was closer to 100 AD. Mark, I would agree is the earliest, 100%. But what I'm saying is they didn't have the complete. You're saying that they had a canon? No, they didn't. Not when Mark. So
they had a canon.
So
how
do you start?
The 2nd century?
Agreed. Okay, but we're talking about 42. You're saying he established that church in 42. Yeah. How can you start a church without having a canon? Whenever the earliest copies we have wasn't even written until 150 years after the church was founded. That makes no sense.
You can't have a church.
So how do you study the letters of Matthew, Mark, and Luke?
The first church was in Antioch, right? Did they have a canon?
No. The first church was in Jerusalem. They were called Christians in the book of Acts.
The first church that Paul set up was in Antioch.
In Antioch, right.
Okay.
Agreed.
So, did they have a canon then? I don't think so.
They had Paul. Paul's gospel is different from the gospels of the four apostles. Completely different.
I don't.
It
Okay.
is.
Okay.
Paul himself even said,
But it wasn't written down.
I
It
understand.
was the revelation that he got on the road.
From Jesus himself.
Right.
I understand that. But what I'm saying is, how do you have a college teaching Christianity without Matthew, Mark, Luke, or Paul's letters?
I believe it started as a church, not as a school. I guess.
I mean, that's a fair-
university.
I would
I think
probably-
it started as he
I would
started
probably
the
lean to
church.
that.
The church was planted. He didn't plant a school first.
I
he
would
planted
say
a church.
that that's probably right. But it begs the question: how then do you have a church that's preaching the canon without Matthew, Luke, John, Revelation, nor Paul's letters?
But do you realize that when before Jesus ascended, and he comes back and he visits all of his people,
Mhm.
he's teaching them, he's opening up their eyes
Mhm.
to the scripture. The scripture they did have was the Old Testament,
Mhm.
and that's probably still what was in the churches at the time until there was no New Testament. All the scripture that they
Agreed.
had was the Old Testament.
I
So
agree.
you have that, and now you have the new revelation of Jesus Christ.
Right,
That's
right.
what that goes along.
Okay, so
with
how would
learning
Mark
the
know
Old-
that? How would Mark
learning
know
the
that
Old-
in 42? How would he know that in 42 when
No
we
way.
don't have writings
No way.
until? How would we know that Mark knew what Matthew, Luke, and John was out preaching? How would he know that? They haven't even wrote it yet.
Because he had been with Paul. He
I
had
understand.
been with
Okay,
Peter.
now we're getting somewhere.
Second-hand account.
This
they're
is-
just telling him.
Hang
this
on.
stuff. Yeah.
Now we're getting somewhere. This is the schism between the early church after Jesus' crucifixion
Right.
and the Pauline Roman Catholic Church doctrine that overtook it. That's exactly what I'm talking about.
I don't understand what you're saying.
Listen, okay. So Jesus told his disciples to take what I'm teaching you and go teach it to other people and set up churches and spread the good news, right?
Yes.
Okay, that's what the early church was supposed to do. That's got nothing to do with Paul or Mark. Nothing. Or Luke for that matter.
Why not? You said it was only 3 years after the
hang on.
crucifixion that
What
Paul,
I understand. My point I'm trying to make is Paul didn't have the gospel of the disciples. He didn't have that. He got it directly from Jesus himself.
And they got it directly from Jesus too.
I understand, but that's where you have the split between Paul's camp, and Peter's camp. Paul says it's to everyone, Gentiles and everybody.
Right.
Peter says, no, it's not. And eventually, Peter changed his tune and got in line with Mark.
Because he didn't realize that it was for everyone.
I understand, but see, that's the problem. That's where the schism happened. How could the original 12 disciples not know, and some guy gets blinded on the way is teaching the guys who were taught by Jesus? That's the schism between the two camps. You've got the early church and the early 12 apostles.
But that doesn't, just because Peter had it one way doesn't mean that the other 11 had the exact same thing.
Peter was, okay, so James and Peter were the early leaders of the Jesus Christ movement after the resurrection, right? What they said was dogma. What they said was what all the other churches were going to agree with. Now you've got Rome getting involved, going off of the Pauline doctrine and the Mark doctrine and the Luke doctrine, who say completely different things at times about what Jesus taught and about what Paul says. You know what I mean? And it wasn't until God revealed to Peter later on down the road that, hey, you're wrong. Don't call any man common. You know what I'm saying? Or, you know what I mean? So it wasn't until he had a direct revelation with him that he changed his tune. The point I was only trying to make was the Roman Catholic version of Christianity overtook the original 12's version of Christianity. That's all I was trying to say. And that's what all the evidence says. That's what Paul,
I don't believe that.
Paul himself said, your way is wrong, my way is right. And the Catholic Church gets most of their stuff from Paul. Actually, all Christianity gets most of their stuff from Paul. Because who do you have talking about the death of Jesus for your sins?
Here.
You only have that with Paul. That's it. It's not in the Gospels. Now there's prophecy saying Jesus is going to die for your sins and et cetera, et cetera. But as far as
that's in
hang on. But as far as it becoming dogmatic and saying this is the good news, the gospel is not preached in the first 4 books of the Bible. The gospel is only preached in Paul. Because what is the gospel? That Jesus Christ died for your sins and that he is coming back again to take his people. The only place you have that is in Paul.
The gospel of Jesus Christ is his death, burial, and resurrection.
Right. Okay. So, and the only place you have that in the Gospels is the last paragraph of not even every Gospel.
Yeah, but I don't think you understand. Like, it's prophesied throughout the entire Old Testament.
Sure.
Jesus comes and he says, hey, like the Old Testament was pointing to me.
Sure.
That's after he ascended up. That's what he told his people to go do. And that's what he told them to go and spread that message. What was prophesied in the Old Testament has been fulfilled.
Right. And they didn't do it right. That's why Paul had to come and set them straight.
Okay. So then what is your beef? I don't understand.
I don't have a beef.
If you understand
I don't have a beef at all. The point I'm trying to make is you don't have the good, like, you don't have washed by the blood or put on the armor of God and all this other beautiful Christianity stuff.
But
that's only from Paul. Everything else is just
it's just fluff. Not fluff.
Everything else is
an embellishment that helps weave it. It's a beautiful tapestry, and everything is woven in together. Like putting on the armor, it has a meaning. You can still get from the gospel message.
How? Only if you read Paul first.
How do you not get that from the gospel?
I'm saying because you only get it because you understand Paul's gospel, right? These early Christians didn't have Paul's gospel; they had the 12 disciples' gospel.
Then what was it? What was it? What was this gospel that
I know what Jesus Christ tried to tell the people what the good news was. Okay, but they didn't understand it yet. He wasn't dead yet. Like, these people thought they were still, even after Jesus died, they still thought they were under the old law. It wasn't until Paul came and said, the old covenant's gone. The new covenant is with Jesus. Mm-hmm. That's the gospel.
Right.
That's not in Matthew, Mark, or Luke. None of it.
Because it's also the whole story of Jesus.
That's what I'm saying. So then how are the early Christians?
Of course it's not there.
So then how is the early church preaching the gospel if they haven't even met Paul yet?
Because he came back.
What do you mean?
He came back after he resurrected. He stayed with them for 40 days.
Okay.
And he explained all of that to them.
But they still got it wrong. That's why
the Jews, they got it wrong pertaining to the Jews and the Gentiles. I believe they got everything else right. The only thing that they got wrong was what the Gentiles need to do.
They were preaching that they were still under old law and that you still had to be circumcised. And
the Gentiles.
Right.
They were preaching that the Gentiles would have to do that.
Agreed.
And that's why Paul said no. But
agreed.
That's what
Jesus' message was. That's what he tried to show the disciples, but they couldn't get it.
Right.
They didn't understand it. Talking to the Gentile woman, right? There'll be a time where no matter where you're at, you can worship God. You don't have to go to the synagogue, right? It wasn't until Paul came and set those guys, just not like a huge course correction, but a slight course correction.
And then you know what? That's funny that you say that is because so who else other than we know about Paul, but like what about the other 12? Who started churches and where? Where did they start?
Right, and that's the point I'm making. I don't think those churches could have been legitimate. They couldn't have been.
Maybe they didn't even start them. Any.
Well, it says that James was the first leader of the church in Jerusalem shortly after, James the Just, the brother of Jesus, shortly after the death of Jesus, was the leader of the church. And then the Catholics' viewpoint will say, Peter was a leader of the church. Which is ironic because, the whole Catholicism is mostly Paul. It's the Pauline Gospels, the Pauline doctrine is what established the Roman Orthodoxy. The Roman Catholic Church, Eastern Orthodox Church, all of these guys are just saying, okay, was Jesus God or not? That was the only split they had. Well, there's
Okay, so Matthew is attributed to starting the Ethiopian Orthodox Church.
Mhm.
I can't find a date,
Mhm.
but hold on.
So now you can kind of see why there's a schism. You've got these guys going out there, starting churches in other places, and here comes Paul saying, you guys are doing it wrong. That's where the schism started. That's what Arian's like, okay, well, if they're wrong about this, what else do we got going on here? He's not deity. He is deity. Do we agree with Paul or do we agree with Peter?
Yeah, but but they weren't. All right. So okay, I understand what you just said.
Mhm.
I totally understand. Hey, if they got this wrong, then maybe this is wrong too.
Sure.
But what Paul and the other apostles had differences on was not the deity of Christ.
How do you know that? How do you know that? Like,
Because they saw him resurrect.
Jesus,
They saw him die on the cross and they saw him resurrect.
Okay, look, now as far as being deity, fine. I agree with that. Is Jesus divine? Absolutely. 100%. Not a problem with that at all.
Right.
Okay? Their beef is, yes, he's divine, but he's not God. And then the other camp, hang on, time out. The other side is saying, you can't be divine, or you can't be divine and not be God. That's what these people were trying to tell everyone. You have to be divine, or the only way you can be divine is if you're God. Well, we know that that's not true. We know that that's not true. That's their interpretation of it. We know that that's not accurate. You can be divine and not be God. 100%. Angels are divine. Okay? The angel of the Lord's divine. Whether
The
he
angel
is
of the Lord is God.
in some instances he is, in some instances he's not. Right? So, I mean, look at it this way. Was Christianity an evolving thing? Yes. When we say, did Christianity start and they have their doctrine in 42? Absolutely not. They may have thought they had it, but that thing has majorly evolved over time. You know, I mean, when I say over time, I just mean from the death of Jesus to the Council of Nicaea.
I understand like normal men, and I'm not talking about Paul. I'm not talking about the apostles or the disciples.
Mhm.
And see, that's another thing. That's a whole nother.
Okay.
Anyway, I'm not talking about these guys because I don't believe that the beef that Paul had and Peter and the other disciples had was on the deity of Christ.
I don't think none of them thought he was God.
Whether he was God or
there's no proof that any of them,
whether he was God or I don't think they debated on that. I think that is a later debate that came from underneath.
I think that early church made it clear that Jesus and God were two separate things. They believed that.
I don't see it.
It was
because like okay.
I mean, these same guys that you're saying
based off the scripture.
Based off the scripture, what? You take John out, and I can argue John 1:1.
But why would you take John out?
What I'm saying is,
why would you take it out?
I'm not saying. Look, what I'm saying is, if you take John 1:1
out,
you cannot out, and you put that under a microscope.
Yeah, you
could 100% get off of the Trinitarian viewpoint of John 1:1.
I don't think so.
Well, that's fine. You don't.
I don't think so, and I think that like there's not. You know what I would say? You can take John. And you would still come to that conclusion because it's in different other spots.
Where? No, I'm saying like where? It's like show me one. You've got
other spots.
You've got Thomas saying my Lord and my God, but if you take that in context of how they spoke back then, it didn't have to mean he's calling him God. That's what happens when you take.
What are you saying? That he's just like using an expletive?
Hang on. Well, no, I'm not saying that's the cheap way out. I'm not saying that at all.
Well, what are you saying?
But what I am saying is,
he's not saying my God.
You can't
what
take.
Is he saying?
You can't, my Lord and my God. right? He's talking about two different things right there. It's all a matter of how you look at the translation.
Mhm.
My Lord, my God. You know what I mean? Like, this is my Lord, this is my God. You know what I mean? It's taken completely out of context. But again,
How do you get that? Other than
okay,
speculation.
there's
Other than
no speculation.
There is speculation.
If you look at the language of Hebrew,
Okay.
where there's only 6,000 characters in the alphabet,
Okay.
and then you look at Greek, which is like over 100,000 characters,
Mm-hmm.
you're telling me that they accurately translated a book from like kindergarten and put it into a language of your doctorate level dissertation type thesis. You know what I mean? Like, you can't translate up. You can translate down, but you can't translate up. There's no words for these things that's in the Greek.
I would have
there's no Hebrew words for them.
I would push back and say that like it's not that Hebrew is actually more complex than the Greek.
It's a more complex language to learn, but there's only 6,000.
And that makes it harder because you have words by putting certain characters together. You have whole sentences. You have whole phrases.
It's deeper than that. It's way deeper.
It's way deep. That's what I'm trying to say.
But not for the reason you're saying.
It's way deeper.
Not for the reason that you're trying to argue. It's deeper than that because you could take one word or one phrase in Hebrew, and the Hebrew culture understand the context in which something's being said. It can mean three different things. In Greek, they don't understand that. They're just reading it verbatim for what it says, and they're translating it the best they can.
That's what I mean. It's like that is actually translating down.
It's translating.
It's translating down.
Greek is
it's more complex.
But see here, it's only complex because there's so much other stuff that comes along with the meaning and the context because of the people. Because of people and traditions and oral traditions. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, but that's not the language.
How you put the words
But
together.
that's not language. That's something that's tied to the language from years and years of traditions that only these people understand. The Greeks wouldn't understand those things.
Right.
So they did their
The
best.
Greeks wouldn't understand it. So it is taking Hebrew, translating it down to the Greek.
Greek is look, whenever you have 20 different words for one thing, there's some words in the New Testament that's not even in Hebrew. That's not even a Hebrew word. Even if you read the Bible, like the Old Testament, like you read some of that stuff, they don't even have a word for that in Greek. They don't even know what it means, but they do their best to try to tell you what they think it means.
Right.
That's all I'm saying. But Greek is a way more difficult language to translate, or it's harder to translate. It'd be a lot easier.
It's harder to translate the Hebrew than it is the Greek. That's why the Bible was written in Greek, because it was a common.
The Bible wasn't written in Greek.
It was written in
Not
Greek.
originally, was it?
You have no proof of that.
Well,
there is no proof.
Okay,
so arguing from silence.
Hang on.
You have to have proof.
Okay, so
you
hang
can't
on.
say that it wasn't written.
Why can't I say that
first? If you can't tell me what that was first.
Hang on a minute. So hang on a second. So you mean to tell me that a bunch of people are okay? Well, we're going to do a show on this because I'll end with this.
I mean, we can finish your thought. I want to know.
I'll end with this. So you mean to tell me a bunch of Palestinian Jews, okay, who may have spoke Koine Greek, which is like a white trash hillbilly version of Greek, like how hillbillies would talk in English? That's what Koine Greek is. You're telling me that's not classical Greek. There's two different types of Greek.
Common Greek.
It's Koine Greek. Right.
Common Greek.
You've got Koine Greek that was spoken by all the merchants.
Common. Yes.
Right. But then you've got classical Greek that is actually the book was translated into Koine Greek.
Okay.
Why would it not have been translated in the classical Greek? That's the point I'm making. It was taken from Hebrew sources, and then, I'll even give you this. The first words maybe could have been written down in Greek, but I guarantee you it was from a Greek-speaking person who was talking to a Hebrew-speaking Jew, follower of Jesus, and that Greek guy was dictating what he said to the best of his ability. There's no evidence at all that Matthew, Mark, or maybe Mark and Luke, absolutely, but that Matthew and John spoke Hebrew or spoke Greek or even wrote Greek. And even
Right. But
even
we're
if
not
they,
talking about we're not talking about each letter, each gospel on its own. I'm talking about when someone compiled it,
Mhm.
they took it and they put it into Koine Greek. Before that point, all you had were pieces.
pieces of what?
All you had were letters.
Letters
Individual letters. All you had were individual gospels. That's all. You didn't have
written in which
you didn't
language?
have a codex. You know what? It could have been.
That's what I'm saying. The originals, I believe. I mean, look at Mark. Even Mark seems to think that we all know Mark spoke Greek, but even Mark quotes Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani.
And I never said that they didn't write, like Paul didn't write his letters in whatever language.
I think Paul wrote Greek. I think Paul would have spoken.
But and the Gospels, I'm not saying that they were all written in Greek. I'm saying that the manuscript, it was originally, when it's compiled, written in Greek.
I understand that.
And people are like, well, the original was written in. No, the original was written in Greek.
No, the original what?
The original manuscript.
Okay, so when you say original manuscript, you mean the first Bible that was all put together was written in Greek.
The first codex.
Okay, the first codex. But that codex had sources, and those original sources were not Greek.
Okay.
That's
fine.
Right.
That's absolutely fine.
And this would be a good place to stop one, but I agree that the first Bible, like codex as you call it, was definitely Greek.
Because
there's no doubt about it.
It was in a common language that everyone could understand.
Before that, I believe that the original Gospels were written in Hebrew, not Mark and Luke, right? Because those aren't apostles. I'm talking about the people who walked with Jesus, right? The book of James, like James, Peter, all that. You think a bunch of poor fishermen spoke Greek, bro? They may have spoke a broken version just like a sell fish.
I think they did because they had to do commerce. They had to sell.
That's what I'm saying.
They spoke with
but I believe that they wrote their original documents in Hebrew, and it was translated into a hillbilly white trash version of Greek known as Koine Greek, which is almost like, and you know, I'm not trying, because I am a redneck. I'm not trying to put anyone down. All I'm saying is you've got formal English, and then you've got, hey man, what y'all doing down there around the corner? You know what I'm saying? That's the difference. That's the thing I'm trying to say. But this was great. This was a good discussion. It really was. And you left me with some things to think on and do some studying on. Thank all of you for watching. And please feel free to drop us some messages and let us know some topics you guys would like to talk about. Or if you have any questions or you want to correct some things or anything you'd like to add to our discussion today, please feel free to get it to us and we will address it on the next live stream.
Yep. Just like, share, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment. My email is in my bio on the channel's bio section. However you want to contact us, just get a hold of us. Let us know what you think. And always remember, Jesus loves you. We'll see you next time. God bless.
Hey guys, thank you. God bless. Awesome.
Awesome.
Mm-hmm. That was good. Good.